Have you ever had this friend who's always itching for an excuse to start up a fight? The guy who hears some other dude saying, "Listen pal, I don't want any trouble," and says, "Are you calling me trouble? Is that what you're calling me, huh?" Well, I have such a friend. And in the interest of protecting his identity, we are going to refer to him as Ant Onion. Well, if Mr. Onion were a video game, he'd probably be Throne of Bhaal. Welcome to Yold Entertainment, my name is Alex, and it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumbing for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. Before the letters DLC became commonplace in video game jargon, there were expansions. And developers wouldn't fool around with their expansions. There were no $7 amounts back in the day. Expansions were full-fleshed games that would keep you entertained for 3 or 4 days, maybe even more if you actually had a life outside the game. Good ones would also make the core game retroactively better by adding replay value to the experience. This was the aspiration of every expansion pack back in the good old days. And kudos to those developers who still live by that philosophy. But what makes an expansion pack stand out and shine with its own light? This is the way we see it in Yold Entertainment. A good expansion pack takes everything that people loved about the original game and cranks it up to 11. Sometimes it's the level design of certain missions, sometimes it's certain moments of gameplay, sometimes it's a piece of lore. By the time an expansion pack enters production stage, it's more than likely that developers already know what worked and what didn't work for their audience in the core game. Good expansions provide a condensed experience of everything that was good about the core game and takes things to the next level. Take Lord of Destruction for Diablo 2. 2 new classes that you can play from the get-go of your adventure were introduced in this expansion, both of which offered fresh experiences that still felt in tune with the game's vibes and mechanics. There was a new location, new bosses that were both challenging and original in concept, new mercenaries for you to hire, new items, some of which were even class-specific, and relics that you could carry about in your inventory for extra bonuses. Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction also added new things that we didn't even know we wanted or needed, and that's another hallmark of a great expansion. Items and item enhancement has always been a big thing in the Diablo universe. In the original Diablo 2, there were gems and skulls that you could socket into items to get additional stat bonuses. The expansion introduced jewels and runes. The former had randomly generated perks, and the latter added fixed bonuses but could also be combined in recipes called rune words for additional bonuses and effects. This not only injected new life and possibilities to your old characters, it not only made it worthwhile to start the game again from scratch, it made you willingly and excitedly put effort and time into researching the Battle.net website to check out rune combinations, their perks, and their drop rates. Now that was a good expansion. But the question is, my dear viewer who didn't come here to hear about Diablo 2 and its expansions, is Throne of Bhaal a good expansion? Does it grab everything that was great about Baldur's Gate and crank it up to 11 while throwing in new mechanics we didn't even know we wanted? Or is it a shameless cash grab that tries to capitalize on the success of one of the greatest games of all time? Well, let's find out, shall we? As you know, we rate games according to a system of categories that feels relevant to the game at hand. And that's not what we're going to do today. But if you are curious about how these other aspects did in our estimation, we encourage you to check out our review on Baldur's Gate 2, which we will leave a link for in the description below. And while you're at it, why not subscribe? When it comes to expansions, you can almost always expect many of the core game's features and mechanics to be the same. There's no point in going through character creation, leveling, graphics, or secondary mechanics this time around. Throne of Bhaal is the 2001 expansion of Baldur's Gate 2, and it is of course included in Beamdog's 2014 enhanced edition of the game. So if you have one, you have the other. So, is there a point in reviewing Throne of Bhaal? Well, sometimes expansions can turn the core game on its ear. Is this one such case? What does Throne of Bhaal add to Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn? The short answer to that question is combat. And excuses to go looking for it. Excuses that would make even Ant Onion cringe. The long answer involves elaborating a little bit further. To be fair, Throne of Bhaal adds a much needed and much welcome dungeon to the core game. Watcher's Keep is an out-of-the-way, tough-as-nails dungeon with puzzly obstacles and fights that adds further challenge and diversity to Baldur's Gate 2. So the tower is a magical prison that holds some creatures of the dark. This tower has been watched for ages by some Helmite priests and knights who call themselves the Knight of the Vigil. So these guys are in the business of not letting some ultra-magical, badass demon escape imprisonment and end the world or some such thing. So they give you a scroll that is meant to enhance the seal that keeps the demon, who's very originally and creatively referred to as the Imprisoned One, trapped within the last floor of the tower. So between you and the imprisoned one stand 6 levels of excruciatingly difficult fights, a few characters whom you can deal with in several ways, and a few puzzles that are well integrated into the experience. I like that this particular dungeon lives up to the experience of the original game. The characters within the tower can be dealt with in very different ways, some of which even include your character's alignment. Also, the way in which you deal with the imprisoned one in the end has a huge impact in the outcome of the mission and in how much of the true nature of the Knights of the Vigil is revealed to you. Watcher's Keep is accessible through the area map in Baldur's Gate 2, so you may take on this dungeon during your camping in the core game, or you may come back to it when you hit the chapters of Throne of Bhaal. Watcher's Keep is pretty much a good example of what you can expect from the rest of the content in the expansion, only, well, better. Throne of Bhaal also adds 3 chapters to the original story, and while the first chapter solidly delivers everything we've come to expect from these series, the game seems to run out of gas after this chapter and ends up being nothing but a bare-bones succession of combat encounters with very little to them in terms of story or lore. Shortly after defeating Irenicus, you find yourself in a pocket plane, and this is more or less where your adventure begins. So let's take some time to talk about this bullshit pocket plane, as it summarizes pretty darn well everything that's wrong with Throne of Bhaal. It seems like the developers wanted to give you a place to go to rest and store your loot, a camp of sorts, which would have been, by the way, the obvious way to go for this feature, but they couldn't provide you with a camp because the city of Saradush, which is the first location you must go to because, reasons, is under siege by one of the Bhaal spawn you have to defeat. So instead of putting a little bit of effort into writing a bit of story about you meeting someone with the information to enter the city through some underground system of tunnels or something like that, you're given a magical bullshit talent that allows you to teleport between your pocket plane and every other location in the game whenever it suits you. Also, you have to defeat a bunch of Bhaal spawn who threaten to end everything much like Sarevok did in the first game. But instead of taking the effort to provide you with reasons to travel to Saradush and from then on out, pull the thread that unveils the mystery of the Bhaal spawn by piecing together their motivations and plans, the story lazily lays it bare through some magical, uber-powered planar realm traveling being known as Solar. Solar knows what's what, who's who, and why's why, but she doesn't tell you everything because of reasons. She's also clearly uber-powered, and despite this being a world-ending affair, she doesn't intervene because, yep, you guessed it, reasons. Like Aunt Onion after a night of heavy drinking, Throne of Bhaal is only concerned with fighting, so everything else is an excuse to get down to business. So almost every important NPC is kinda there to point you in the direction of the next guy or gal whose ass you've got to beat to a pulp. There are bits and pieces of context about your mother or about how you and not Sarevok became Garion's ward, but they are thrown at you like tiny pebbles of bullshit. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all about lore and context, and this piece of context about your past might have not been a bad thing to learn about if you had come by this information by voluntarily taking the time and effort to piece it together. But this is not how Throne of Bhaal did it. Instead, Solar introduces you to some illusory avatars of people that you have supposedly known. And these people are like some medieval fantasy version of the spirits who visit Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. These characters puke out their inconsequential piece, and then of course, you have to fight them in your bullshit pocket plane. Because reasons. You begin your adventure in Throne of Bhaal alongside those companions with which you defeated Irenicus, but the devs didn't want to strip you of the possibility of joining with some of your other companions. So instead of taking the time and effort to provide your other companions with reasons of their own to appear here or there, maybe in Saradush or maybe on the road between locations, they introduced the Spirit of Fate, some magical bullshit being capable of summoning all your other companions out of thin air. After taking in your first ration of bullshit in the pocket plane, you are teleported to Saradush, because the plane takes you where you need to go, which is not always where you want to go. Well, that's convenient. Anyhow, you find yourself in Saradush and you meet Melisande, who's there to tell you what's going on. What is going on is that some Bhaal spawn giant and his army are laying siege to the city. There are some other Bhaal spawn around the city, but apparently they are the good sort, and Melisande has taken upon herself to protect them. Why are there good Bhaal spawn? What's their purpose in the story?
I don't know. Of course not.
Walking about Saradush, meeting its people, and lending out a hand with local troubles felt like proper good old Baldur's Gating. Quests were plentiful and there was more than one way to go on about them. I particularly liked the quest that had to do with getting to the bottom of the mystery about who opened the gates to the invaders. This quest involved everything that I had come to love about Baldur's Gate: decisions that mattered, different possible outcomes, and a balanced combination of combat and dialogue. And there's a lot more like that in Saradush to season the crescendo of your main quest until it climaxes with a fight against the local orc leader Gromnir Ilkhan. You also run into renowned Faerun chronicler Volotham Gedarn, a very important character in D&D lore who also makes an appearance in other D&D games like Baldur's Gate and the Neverwinter Nights 2 expansion Storm of Zehir. So your first moments in Throne of Bhaal are interesting and even promising. Unfortunately, once you're done kicking Gromnir's butt, it's all downhill from there. It's not like there aren't any quests after that, but they seem like the bare minimum effort, both in quantity and quality. There is, however, one notable exception. There's this quest in which a merchant called Marlowe asks you to kill a leech who has cursed his daughter. This curse has caused the girl to become paralyzed and permanently on the brink of death. Her father doesn't tell you the whole deal, but if you decide to listen to the leech's side of the story, rather than straight out attacking him without mincing words, you learn that although the leech is indeed a creature of evil, he cursed Marlowe's daughter because Marlowe failed to uphold his end of the bargain in his dealings with the leech. It's interesting that this quest seems to be partly based on the play Dr. Faustus by British dramaturg Christopher Marlowe, hence the name of the NPC who gives you the quest. The leech is named von Geth. One can only imagine that this is meant to be a tribute to Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote Faust, a play that is also based on Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. This quest can be resolved in 3 different ways, all of which yield different outcomes and rewards. Sadly, this quest is more an exception than a rule in Throne of Bhaal. There's also a companion quest for Nira, which, like everything else in Throne of Bhaal, feels like an excuse to get our character into a fight. And though it entails one of the most exciting fights in the game and a couple of cool locations, story-wise, it feels detached and redundant for Nira's character arc. And I really have no reason to believe that any of the other quests for any of your other new companions is any better. Like we've said before, the combat in Throne of Bhaal is the best thing about the package. It is significantly more challenging than in the core game, and for the most part tactically engaging, but even this aspect of the game is watered down by some of the game's other concepts. In the original game, there was an undeniable feeling of adventure to your dungeon crawling, as there was always a tense, lingering sensation that the only way out was forward, that resting was a gander that you were not always willing to take because the risk was generally high, and that choosing your loot carefully because your inventory space was limited was very much a thing. But this time around, you have your convenient magical bullshit talent that allows you to simply sap back to your pocket plane and rest easy, store your loot, and maybe even change companions that are better suited for the mission at hand. And while you can self-impose not to use that talent, it cheapens combat and questing and all but murders the feeling of adventure the original game had. The final confrontation in Throne of Bhaal comes from a plot twist that you can see coming 3 towns away. Like everything else in the game, it feels abrupt, rushed, and lazily written. It's probably the most challenging fight in the entire saga, and it does lay the ground for a final moment of closure with your companions and a decent explanatory final succession of stills that rounds up things for you and those companions who joined you for the final fight. But this is an expansion for Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Am, and decent doesn't cut it. If this were a boxing match between Aunt Onion and some other drunkard at the local pub, I would say that Watcher's Keep Dungeon, your first moments in Saradush, and a couple of quests and fights here and there keep Throne of Bhaal in the fight for some rounds. But it doesn't make up for the lackluster, lazy, and plot-convenient writing devices whose main purpose seems to have been saving the original developers the pain and effort of creating a few more locations, characters, dialogues, and story arcs. And that is a real shame, as you probably want to remember the greatest RPG of all time as, well, just that. This is probably a good time to add that this is the buggiest game in the series. It crashed a couple of times, it stuttered a couple more, and I had at least 3 or 4 nasty bugs. Also, the sound mix in Throne of Bhaal is hands down the worst of the series, as it's riddled with volume and clipping issues. None of that per se is necessarily the hallmark of a bad game, but it definitely adds to the feeling that the efforts here were limited to milking the success of the original game, rather than coming up with something that would take it to the next level. So this all takes us to our original question. Is Throne of Bhaal a good expansion?
I don't believe that.
Is it a bad expansion? I don't believe so either. While I had a few good moments with it, especially with the content accessible from the campaign and the core game, I think it doesn't do justice to a game that may very well be the best classic RPG of all time. And that's all I have for you today. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.